I'm Liz Costa. I'm a director at the Behavioural Insights team, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you all to our first webinar of our Hindsight 2020 series. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We're putting on this series over the next few weeks. Really, BIT's view is that many of the challenges presented by the pandemic, as well as the possible responses and positive opportunities for resets, are in fact behavioural in nature. So we've put together this series to explore these issues and have an open and interesting discussion about them with all of you. Before I get started, we've got a few housekeeping issues. So we're on Zoom today. If you would like to ask a question, there's a raise your hand function at the bottom of your screen. That will bring to the attention of the panelists that you've asked a question, and I will be repeating those questions. We prefer you to stay on mute if possible because it makes the webinar smoother. There's also going to be a poll launched during the webinar, and you'll be able to see that at the bottom of your screen as well. I also want to note that the webinar is being recorded today. We will make it available afterwards as well. We'd be happy for you to share it with your networks as well. So in terms of how we're going to run this morning, the three of us are going to make some opening remarks, and then I'll lead a discussion with Tony and Philip, and then leave plenty of time for audience questions. We'll have a hopefully wide-ranging, interesting discussion. But firstly, I want to introduce my fabulous panelists for this morning. We have joining us Tony Danker and Philip Hargreaves. Tony is the founding CEO of Be the Business, which is a business movement designed to bring together companies and make the UK home to the most ambitious and most productive firms in the world. And throughout the crisis, Tony and Be the Business have really been focused on bringing companies together and helping them share tactics for adaptation, innovation and recovery. And so Tony is going to talk through that today. I'd also like to note in November, Tony is going to take up the post of Director General of the Confederation of British Industry. So while Be the Business is particularly focused on SMEs, and that's going to be the focus of our discussion today, I'm sure Tony also has an eye to the wider implications for businesses of all sizes and sectors, and may be able to comment on those later on as well. I'm also thrilled to welcome Philip Hargreaves. Philip's worked in commercial and corporate fundraising for the past 40 years, and he's now responsible for the growth company Business Growth Hub's Access to Finance team. And in that role, Philip works closely with partners in the business and professional communities. And Philip and his team are passionate about supporting SMEs, particularly in the Northwest, who are looking to grow. And particularly through the crisis, Philip has been supporting those businesses to make complex financial decisions to both survive the crisis and thrive throughout and after it. So it's a real pleasure to have you both here today. Thank you for joining us.
Morning.
I'm going to make some brief opening remarks to frame the discussion, and then I'm going to hand over to Tony and Philip. So to get us started, I wanted to start with some statistics. So this is, by many measure, the biggest economic shock in modern history. And the numbers on this slide are extremely sobering. Things still remain highly uncertain, but the illustrative scenarios produced by the Office for Budget Responsibility and the Bank of England suggest that the UK economy could be facing its largest annual fall in output in over 300 years. But with these sobering numbers, there's also been a speedy and in many ways unprecedented policy response and enormous adaptation and innovation on the part of businesses. And really what I want to touch on here is that there's several aspects of the nature of this crisis that make the traditional playbook for both policymakers and businesses less relevant to the circumstances that we find ourselves in today. I personally worked at the Australian Treasury during the global financial crisis, and the Australian response during that crisis was summarised in the slogan, "Go early, go hard, go households." And really that was trying to capture what was, and at the time, unprecedented consumer stimulus package. It was designed to put cash in the pockets of households so that they could go out and spend it immediately. and stimulate the economy. And obviously, that approach to stimulating demand and consumer confidence needs significant rethinking while the country remains either fully or partly in lockdown. We've also seen that the crisis has had a very uneven impact. While many households have been deeply affected and have fallen into debt, there have been others who've been able to save at a rate higher than that they've ever been able to before. And likewise, while some businesses have been unable to operate and have really struggled, there have been others that have been able to quickly adapt and innovate and have thrived. And of course, overlaying all of this, there is no clear end in sight. So all of this really requires a fresh and innovative approach to recovery, and in my view, also an iterative and experimental approach. And really, we're having this discussion today because we think that behavioural insights provides a useful lens to both think through the challenges facing businesses through this time, but also think about some fresh and different approaches to support economic recovery and particularly support SMEs through this time. So we're going to break today's discussion into three main parts. Firstly, we're going to touch on how COVID exacerbated existing challenges that were facing SMEs. Particularly a recent report from the Institute for Government suggested that COVID has derailed businesses' Brexit preparations, particularly amongst smaller businesses. And also overlaying all of this, and particularly a focus for both Tony and Philip, is looking at the UK's productivity puzzle and thinking about how to boost productivity, particularly amongst SMEs, in order to improve the competitiveness of UK businesses. And obviously the shape of that challenge is very different when the immediate aim of many businesses is survival rather than productivity improvements. We're going to focus most of the discussion on the challenges created by the immediate response to COVID. In many ways, the decisions for SMEs during full lockdown were largely driven by the context. Many were ordered to close their physical premises and were directed to support available. But as Tony's pointed out, as lockdowns ease, and yet we're very far from normality, SMEs are now faced with a much more complex set of decisions around how to comply with new regulations, how to make their businesses COVID secure, how to inspire consumer trust, draw on their peer networks, and adapt their business models. And if we can go to the next slide, I just want to briefly present the results of an experiment that we ran at BIT last week. And really what we were looking to do was understand how some of these issues interact and understand the impact of various measures, particularly on people's willingness to visit a restaurant. And really what we were trying to unpick here was, what are the different things that are holding back economic recovery? And is it really depressed incomes and depressed consumption as traditional economic models would suggest? Or is there a deeper set of beliefs and preferences at play? And if that's the case, how should we design financial incentives so that they do stimulate demand and inspire consumer trust? So what we did is we collected an online representative sample of over 5,000 UK adults. We ran this last week on our online experimentation platform Predictive. And the participants were randomly assigned to see a restaurant scenario with varying safety measures, with or without a financial incentive to visit, similar to the government's Help Out to Eat Out scheme. And what we measured was both their perception of the safety of the restaurant, but also their willingness to visit. And what we found overall was that willingness to visit the restaurant was highly correlated with perceived safety. So only 28% of people said that they would visit where there was no visible safety measures, but that proportion increased to 63% when all of these measures were in place. So really what we're seeing here, we know that there's a trade-off between ensuring a robust economic recovery and reducing transmission of the virus. And we need a recovery package that balances both of those things. And what the results of this experiment show is that when it comes to business support, it's not only the financial factors that are important. So For restaurants specifically, we see that these financial incentives are effective, but in fact, actually coupling them with a broader package of measures to get restaurants to display visible safety measures would offer an extra boost on top of those discounts and hopefully inspire greater consumer trust and greater support for businesses. So I'll go back to the continuum. The last point that we want to discuss today is the positive longer-term resets with businesses. You know, the word crisis has very distinctly negative connotations for us in modern times, but actually the original meaning of the word was far more neutral, and it was used to refer to any decisive turning point. And so my hope is for SMEs and businesses, we can actually embrace the positive connotations of crisis and use this as a turning point to rebuild and build back better. So we're also going to discuss the positive opportunities around developing new and more flexible work practices that incentivize and engage staff, and also investing in new tools and technology that drive innovation and productivity. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Tony, and Tony's particularly going to talk about what he's hearing from businesses about the main challenges that they're facing at this time, and also talk about Be the Business's Rebuild initiative. Over to you, Tony.
Thanks, Liz. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining on a Friday morning. And I hope you've got a cup of tea and settled in. We were just joking before we began that British Zoom calls begin with everybody fixing themselves a cup of tea and settling down. I guess there's two things just to build on Liz's opening that I think are worth opening with from my perspective. The first one is, you know, that idea of crisis being a decisive turning point. We've been in existence at Be the Business for 3 years. Our mission was to drive up firm level productivity improvement across the country. And if you had told me 6 months ago that we were about to see mass adoption of innovation, mass adoption of technology, and mass adoption of sort of efficiency-oriented productivity, I would have bitten your hand off. And that's what's happened, obviously for tragic reasons. But we've seen incredible levels of this activity. So we have seen, by our analysis, 3 years worth of innovation in 3 months. We've seen technology adoption, even in mature categories like e-commerce, we've seen 4 times the rate of adoption than in the whole of last year. And obviously, very, very strong focus on efficiency. Now, I don't pretend for a moment that that's going to lead to productivity uplift, because of course, productivity is also about output and performance, and that is going to be naturally suppressed. But what's really interesting is whether or not the innovation and technology adoption that we've seen in the last 3 or 4 months is here to stay. We've just done some survey work and some interview work about this very question. And we've seen that businesses are, roughly speaking, a third split on the subject of innovation. So a third of businesses, to be precise, 31%, have been absolutely innovating. They have changed their business models, they've changed their practices, they've changed their audiences, they've changed their products. They've changed a lot in the last 3 or 4 months. Now, let's be clear, necessity is the mother of invention. And I've got a million stories when we get into this about why businesses have done this, and which businesses have done this and how. So about a third of businesses, 31%, have really rapidly innovated. On the other extreme, we've got 33% are what we call stickers. And they're people who frankly stayed still, played it safe, they've been happy to shrink a little bit, and they want to see out the crisis. By the way, a higher proportion in that category of micro businesses, higher proportion of older businesses and older business owners. There's the 3 categories there without the numbers. And they've been, their stance is just to wait this out. They are not innovating. They are not changing everything. They think the world will come back to them and they'll be ready when the world comes back. And by the way, they may well be right. So I think as we sometimes say in poker, the right answer is to stick. And then a third are undecided. And this is a really interesting camp. They are a bunch of firms who, frankly, are thinking quite hard about dramatic decisions or innovations, but they're in wait and see mode. And in particular, they're in wait and see mode around whether or not Restart works. And that might be practical stuff like Liz alluded to in terms of, is it possible to do social distancing in my store? Is it possible to get people working from home versus working in the office? Or frankly, it's about demand. And it's about whether or not demand is going to be at a level to justify the economics. So that's the sort of perspective about innovators, stickers, and undecided. The other thing that's going on that we've seen a lot of is if you could just pause for a moment and have a moment of empathy for what it's been like to own a business in the last 4 months. And typically, and I've been spending a lot of time talking to owners of businesses, the first couple of days were horrendous and the world caved in. But then they made 20 huge decisions a week. Decisions the like of which, by the way, you'd only take, 1 or 2 a year. And because necessity required it, and because government forced their hand, these businesses made very dramatic decisions about their people, about their finances, about their premises, about their product offerings. And frankly, lockdown turned all these business owners into sort of super CEOs. They were unbelievably decisive and directive and in crisis management mode. But it turns out that restart is far harder than lockdown. You're a business owner, because you have a set of choices now over which there is total discretion. I mean, not total discretion, there's constraints, but there's real discretion about whether or not you open this or open that, whether or not you stick with product A or go with product B. And it's actually incredibly difficult to be a business owner making decisions right now in restart. And I'll just give one example. We can lose the slide, Hubert. I'll just give one example. I spoke to a pub owner in Cornwall a couple of weeks ago. The pub owner owns 3 pubs. And when lockdown came, naturally, he shut the pubs. And during lockdown, he's run a delivery business. And frankly, the business has been profitable. Now, he's opened the pubs again. But here's his problem. Pretty much all his costs have come back and more, because he needs more staff for outdoors work, more staff cleaning, and he needs to build signage, and he needs to comply with the regulations. He needs to do quite a lot of work. And demand's back at 50%. And so he's now running loss-making businesses. So that idea that the economy just comes back and gets going is not true. Costs come back quickly, demand comes back slowly. And so restart becomes a really complicated period to be a business owner. So I'm going to stop there, Liz, with those couple of points. A segment of where people are feeling attitudinally and in terms of their actions, innovating, sticking, or undecided. And then, spare a moment for the decision-making mindset of a business owner. In lockdown, they were hero CEOs. And now in restart, there are some very big and complicated decisions. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Tony. Just before we move on to Philip, one quick question. Have you done any thinking or work on how to shift people between these categories or understand what's driving them into each one in the first place?
Yeah, look, we have, and we are unashamedly pro-technology adoption, and we are unashamedly pro-innovation. But I think we should also just be careful, because a lot of the businesses, it's not fair to say that the innovators win and the stickers lose.
Sure.
A lot of those innovators, frankly, are in forced innovation positions, right? They're hospitality businesses who are really struggling. And a lot of the stickers could have very robust and long-term business models. But in general, everything we know about long-term productivity is that the UK has completely underperformed in innovation and technology adoption. And we have failed to diffuse those practices around the economy. And so the notion that an external shock can create this kind of impotence, and by the way, can also create confidence and capability. The thing we know most about technology adoption is that confidence and capability is at the heart of it. And so people might just have got good at Zoom. But if they've got good at Zoom, they've also gone up the learning curve in terms of confidence and capability around technology, and they are starting to look at more fundamental productivity technologies. So we are trying to capture that growth in confidence and capability, that innovating mindset, and encourage businesses to go further. But I wouldn't say that the segments automatically determine whether or not people will win.
Very interesting, thank you. Philip, I'm going to hand it over to you. Philip's also going to talk about what he's seeing on the ground in terms of the challenges that businesses are facing at the moment, and also particularly talk about the regional impact of this. Philip's based in Manchester and is particularly focused on the Northwest.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Yes, I'm based in Manchester, so hence the Lancastrian accent, so apologies. Hope you can understand what I'm saying in some ways. Hubert, if you could just move on to the next slide, that'd be helpful. I just really wanted, before I get into talking generally about what we're seeing, is what the access to finance can do and what access to finance services up and down the country can do with support. We support eligible SMEs to become investment ready, and investment readiness means a lot of things to a lot of different people, but what effectively, to me, that says is about how businesses present their own business case to funders, and that's around business planning, financial modelling, pitch decks, pitch preparation, and how you actually position your own business in the context of the different funders that you might be speaking to, whether that's debt funders, equity funders, whether you're looking for grants, whether you're looking for a mixture of funding options. And another strand that we do is introduce businesses to appropriate funders. It's simple, it's a focused proposition, and it's been extremely busy, as you can imagine, during the last 3 or 4 months in terms of lockdown, in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, and in terms of the kind of things that Tony was talking about around businesses. The one thing I would say, actually just segueing back to what Tony said in terms of the stickers and the innovators, you know, we know statistically that around only 30-35% of businesses take on external finance, and that's something which has grown in terms of the non-borrowers, has grown during the last 10 years ago, since the last recession. These businesses, typically described as happy non-borrowers, are happy to grow organically, but they won't take a chance. They don't want to typically innovate business, but they're just happy to grow slowly but surely. It's interesting, when I look statistically, I was looking this morning at some facts and figures, and basically, if you look at businesses, and this is across the broad range of SMEs up to £25 million turnover, the average profit generated by businesses across the median range is £8,000 per annum. It's absolutely nothing when you look at it from that basis. And yes, of course, larger businesses tend to generate more profit. Those really small micro businesses with 0 or 1 to 5 staff generate a lot less profit. But it's interesting that these businesses, typically at the lower end, have little by way of fat on the back to support them through problems and issues which are impacted by the pandemic we're seeing today. And it's not surprising that so many businesses are really struggling and have struggled. Hubert, if you can just move on to the next slide, please. Just kind of talking about the pillars of the access to finance service. We provide a service which is fully funded, which means that there's no cost to businesses that access that service. It's funded at the moment, interestingly enough, by the European Union through the European Regional Development Fund and partially by the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. We provide an impartial and independent service, which means that, you know, we're not aligned to any specific funders or lenders. We provide credible specialists who've got experience and knowledge, and, you know, average age of my team is something like 55, so they've been around the block a bit. We're certainly complementary, and we don't get, you know, tread on the toes of any banks, any other funders, any alternative finance providers, and we've got links to business support programs, and certainly we've got links to Tony's Be the Business service as well. I think if you just move on to the next slide, Hubert. And key aspects of what we're trying to do with businesses at the moment is through our Strive and Thrive proposition. The Strive is around the bits about how businesses can adapt in order to survive the change and challenges thrown up by the COVID pandemic, and how to manage things that are crucial, such as cash flow, and that's been important for most businesses. We've carried out a survey across 3,500 businesses since lockdown. 71% of those businesses, and these are typically low-level SMEs, saw dramatic, if not catastrophic, decrease in sales, as you would imagine. 33% of those had serious cash flow issues, and 56% of those businesses furloughed staff, so pretty much higher than some of those on the national averages. So you can imagine that the work that we've been doing with businesses over the last 3 months has been quite challenging, quite tough, and we've had to make sure that we can help those businesses as best we can. We're looking at the Thrive bit about how businesses can respond to the pandemic and how they can grow back bigger, grow back better, and how they can make use of the things like Tony said in terms of new technology and how they can come back, into the marketplace. We're helping businesses now pretty much look at things like resilience plans, strategy planning, understanding the marketplace, whether they got to pivot in terms of the customer base that they're looking for and looking at, and how those matters can be impacted by the likes of what we do and how we can promote and support businesses going forward. I know that's as much as I'll say until the questions come through, Elizabeth.
Great, thanks, Philip. Philip, I'm interested, there's a very interesting strand of behavioural science looking at individual financial decision making, and the research indicates that where individuals have money worries, it takes up what we call cognitive bandwidth and makes it more difficult for them to make good and timely decisions. And as a result of that, the Behavioural Insights team has long advocated for policies that help individuals build up a rainy day savings buffer, so that they have that cash reserve when things do go wrong. Do you think there's an analogue to SMEs, and has this crisis changed your thinking about what an appropriate level of cash reserve for SMEs is, how that might interact with their decision making?
I think it's a challenging question, that's for sure. I think there's no one answer to what a certain level of cash might be, which will protect and support a business. The research that we've done, you're pretty much saying that those businesses who see a positive cash position have got something between 3 and 6 months in terms of what they perceive to be adequate cash flows. I think some businesses we've seen have burnt through cash really quickly in the pandemic, and to some degree, I think a number of businesses have pretty much put their head in the sand and not taken actions at an early stage. The thing we were doing right at day one was asking businesses to look at their cash flow positions. Sorry, somebody's just making a cup of coffee. I do apologise. We asked businesses to look critically at their cash flow positions, things like, cancel the payments that you don't need to make, talk to suppliers, talk to your clients, talk to your bankers, talk to your landlords, make sure that where you can cut the cost. And that's I guess what we were doing for the first 6 weeks, asking businesses to strategically look at cash flow and make sure they could cut it as far as possible. We know that some businesses have got cash available, but they're burning through that at a rate of knots. And as Tony said, with his example of the guy that was running the pub business in the southwest, I mean, businesses are burning through cash dramatically and continue to do so. We expect, and we'll probably talk a little bit about government schemes that have supported businesses through things like C-bills, through things like bounce back loans. We've seen the spike in that, and we've seen that tailing off in the last few weeks, but we pretty much expect another spike in activity around businesses needing to seek external finance to support cash flow in the next few weeks, particularly as those businesses come back into the marketplace, take staff off furlough and back onto the wages bill as they begin to look to generate new markets and look for new business and start to think of ways in which they can get back into the world of work.
Liz, just to build on Philip's point on cash, and it links a little bit to, I think it was Edwin's question in the Q&A, around, will there just be creative destruction now? Will there just be survival of the fittest of the businesses? And there might be some element of that over the long run, but in the short run, I think it's been a bit more like a game of musical chairs, where the music stopped on lockdown day, and your fate was determined either by the sector you were in, obviously, or by your cash position, which, by the way, was not necessarily about whether or not you were a good financial planner, it's about where you were in your stage of the business. So I spoke to 2 businesses very early on, one who had been saving £200,000 or £300,000 and had just spent them on new premises and had no cash and were investing in new premises for growth. I spoke to another manufacturer in the Northwest, in fact, who had actually been saving money to invest in brand new capital equipment and hadn't spent it yet. And so they were cash rich. So I think the realities of your position were almost, you know, your trajectory out of the crisis was somehow predestined. Now, of course, performance matters, it counts. But I think people should recognize that, you know, a whole series of accidents might have affected your cash position. A whole series of well-intentioned and well-taken decisions may have just made you that in March this year you were low on cash.
Absolutely.
Well,
I think particularly
it is
for
worth bearing
startups
that in mind.
as well.
Yeah, well, startups, of course. I mean, you know, startups, as we all know, are operating off the promise, and they're raising cash off a promise, not off necessarily off real P&L success. As yeah, that's right.
Exactly, and where they were at the point in their raise, I think, determines the success or failure of many of them.
That's right.
Before we dive into audience questions, and please keep those coming, I want to start by, both of you touched on just the complexity of the current landscape for SMEs. In preparation for this webinar, we went to the government's guidance page on how to reopen your business safely during COVID. And we completed the checklist from the point of view of a cafe with several staff. And the results that we got back were 12 pages of advice with around 170 bullet points, all very clear, sound advice, but obviously a huge and complex amount of information for individuals and businesses to take in. How are you both thinking about your roles in the Growth Hub and in Be the Business in terms of helping businesses understand the regulatory environment at the moment, and also helping them prioritise how they go about complying with those regulations and inspiring consumer trust?
Shall I, Liz? Sorry, Philip, do you want to go?
No, you go, Tony, it's fine.
So I think, well, look, first of all, at the beginning, and I think to some degree still, but it's changed, huge degree of appetite for information. You know, somebody used a metaphor with me the other day that for SMEs, the yellow taxi light is on. And that's a very interesting opportunity, by the way. But there's three kinds of information, and we've seen people go through these three kinds of information consumption. And by the way, our traffic and engagement time is off the charts compared to anything, you know, 700% uplifts in engagement. I mean, right, huge traffic surge. In the beginning, it's a search for basic information. So everybody's built a COVID hub, right? And we can all tell you what you need to know about the guidelines. And everybody's first wave of information is they consume, as you've done, the guidelines. They then almost universally do a second thing, which is they then look to how their peers are interpreting the guidelines, right? What are you doing in your shop? How have you thought about insurance? Are you doing masks or not doing masks? So people move very quickly from consuming the objective information to what are their peers doing. Peer exchange is absolutely the most dominant form of influence in the SME market, and people are really hungry for it. By the way, it then goes into a third and deeper level, which is what are the choices you're making for your business. So we've seen this migration. I mean, it's almost a funnel, but it's not quite that linear from, yes, I want to understand the guidelines and their complexity. My ability to make choices, however, needs something else. And it probably needs testing my instincts for what to do on my peers. And then when I get into exchanging with peers, and this is what we think is a big opportunity to Be the Business, I then actually want to spend more time with peers thinking about business strategy and choices. So that's my observation about information consumption. Yes, they have the overload that you describe. The way they interpret it and make decisions best is talking to a peer or a business advisor, but certainly when it comes to interpretation of guidelines, talking to a peer.
Great, thank you. Philip, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Tony's absolutely correct. I mean, one of the things that the hubs have done and other businesses is to kind of collate that data and information and put it together in a kind of concise way, which is easy to understand. I mean, I received government emails, and in the first few weeks, I was receiving 20, 30, 40 gov.uk emails per day telling me what was going on, what was changing, how that was going. So we codified and summarised that and put it onto our coronavirus website. We made sure that the teams that we have were fully appraised of the information to make sure they could talk to businesses in a robust and appropriate way. We provided a lot of support around risk assessment, risk planning. We've done a lot of work with businesses around supply chains, particularly those supply chains that are a little bit broken. And we're trying to help embed a local supply chains, particularly in places like the East Lancs corridor in the northwest, which works through the aerospace industry, particularly with BAE Systems and other such organisations. We've helped businesses, manage that finance and cash flow. But I guess I agree with Tony on that. And one thing that we understand is that businesses don't always come forward to seek support and guidance. And when I was trying to reach out to 25,000 businesses in Greater Manchester just to say that, somebody is here, somebody can listen, somebody can help. It's that kind of sounding board and that mentoring piece that we want to provide to businesses to help them understand that whilst they critically own the business and they've got to make some strategic decisions going forward, but, others who've been there, have done it before, understand the circumstances they're in, can help them. And that's important. We're also working with government through BAYS to develop and deliver a range of peer-to-peer networks that are going to come forward. So that piece that Tony talked about around peer-to-peer support is invaluable to small businesses, particularly those that don't have wide-ranging boards to draw upon in terms of a range of skills and expertise. Many small businesses just have the expertise of actually doing what they do and doing it well. They don't have the finance director, they don't have a HR director. They need help and understanding about what they can do, and that's important as they, come back into the marketplace.
Let's pick up on that theme of mentoring and peer-to-peer support. I know that's something that both of your organisations have been real champions of in the past. And, there's some really interesting and positive experimental evidence about the impact of mentoring and peer support on productivity and business performance. I think one of the challenges for policymakers in particular and organisations such as yourselves is how to scale those programs. And I do wonder whether, the great shift to online platforms during this crisis presents new opportunities to scale and distribute those programs in different ways.
Well, I'll jump in on that one. I mean, Philip and I, we collaborate. We are partners in delivering the Be the Business Growth mentoring program. And it's an attempt, I think mentoring programs and peer-to-peer programs are to some degree scalable because they're about leveraging the resources that exist within the business community to support each other. And so they are designed for scale in that regard. And our mentoring programs and peer-to-peer programs, I mean, they're sort of free or very inexpensive because they're about bringing peers together or bringing business mentors who are volunteering. I do think they are. I think they are pretty high impact. Well, I'll let Philip come in, but I can say a little bit more about how and why. Philip, do you want to come in on that?
In terms, Elizabeth, around whether they're scalable with an online proposition. I'm quite old school, unfortunately. I'm kind of rapidly rocketing towards my 60s, and whether I misunderstand the question, but from my perspective, there's nothing better than face-to-face connections and discussions. I think it works, and it works well. It's problematic for.
That's correct, and that's sort of what the evidence suggests is that face-to-face is the most effective, but it's obviously also quite expensive and difficult to coordinate, particularly in current times. So my question was more whether you think this might present an opportunity to scale in a lower cost way.
I guess there will, because we're connecting with lots of organisations, individuals, and businesses in a lower cost connectable way. I mean, we're connecting with 250 people on this webinar today, and that's, an important way forward. But I guess what I was saying, Elizabeth, is that on one hand, yes, it will allow us to scale and focus in one way, but on another hand, I think it takes away that personal touch that we have with businesses.
Yeah, I think peer-to-peer works great digitally. And I think we're all getting good at webinars, and we've had a lot of success with small group webinars, right? With literally 5 to 10 people on a webinar together with peer exchange. I think mentoring has seen the opposite happen, where, and by the way, the same has happened in professional services, which is people are reluctant to engage with somebody brand new right now. So if you come back to what I said originally about how difficult it is to be a business owner right now and the high stakes of the decisions you're making, you're unlikely to want to be mentored or advised by a stranger. So the professional services firms are all talking about an inability to win new clients at this period, but a lot of success in returning to old clients. And what we found in our mentoring program is a high appetite to call up the mentor I've had for the last year, a lower appetite on the part of business owners to get a new mentor right now.
Yeah,
I think it's entirely understandable. It's a behavioral issue. So I think digital is great for peer-to-peer because everybody's spending their life digitally exchanging with peers. So I think we could double down on that. Mentoring, I think, might be the opposite is true.
Very interesting. Let's turn to the longer term reset opportunities. Given what you're seeing in the shift in mindset in business owners in particular, you talked about confidence and capability and the types of decisions that they're making. What's your view at this point in time about which of the shifts that they've made as organizations will stick? Do you think that shifts to working remotely by default will stick? Do you think shifts to greater appetite for innovation and technology adoption will stick? And if not, what needs to happen to make those things stick?
I think the move to remote working will definitely stick. I mean, somebody that's worked in an office for 40 years and probably the last 10 years has gone into an office on a daily basis for no other reason than I wanted to go into the office on a daily basis to see friends, colleagues, and to work at the desk I'd worked at for the last 10 years. I think the enforced move away from that position into remote working has proven that productivity can increase. Connections with family can be better and stronger. I think that the remote working element will undoubtedly stick for many, many people and many businesses and make, the recruitment of people more of a national and international piece, if you will. We're already seeing in my own company, people being recruited online, inducted online, trained online. We've got people working in our organization I've never met personally, and that's only in the last 3 months. And I think that will remain and stay the same. So what a change in the way in which we manage our businesses and organize the way in which we work. And I think that certainly will stick going forward. I don't see that changing. And certainly we are not going back into our office in any way, shape or form until 2021 hits. And even then it will be in a much more, we'll certainly be, fewer days in the office than we do at the moment.
So talking to some global businesses who've had offices in Asia where lockdowns ended and restarts well ahead, they all account for an interesting trend whereby meetings are either working face-to-face, everybody's face-to-face, or everybody's online, but mixed economy meetings are not working. So half the people in the room is not working, and people have given up on it already. And so you're deciding whether or not a meeting is going to be face-to-face or virtual, but you're not trying to blend. So I think that's just worth, that's one thought bearing in mind. Look, one of the most interesting opportunities, and it's exactly what your question is about, is do we think that we can sustain the levels of innovation and technology adoption that have been required? Can we sustain them in the recovery period? And my assumption was not that actually the bandwidth of business owners and companies in everything they have to optimize for now would leave them without bandwidth to be able to, you know, put in a new CRM system or redesign the store or get staff on new kinds of training. Actually, interviewing SMEs in the last few weeks, they've told me the opposite. And what they account for are two things. Number one, the margin squeeze of COVID is thus, it is that big that the imperative for change in your business is very high. So why, you know, should we implement a technology system that promises 20%, you know, productivity gain? In the past, yeah, maybe we're a bit too busy now. Frankly, if it's got 20% productivity gain, if I can bring less people back into the office, I'm afraid to say if I can bring less people off furlough, the margin squeeze is so high that you have to do it. And so I think businesses will try and do it for margin reasons. But the second more interesting behavioral feedback that I've had is that there's a very high change readiness on the part of staff. That actually, as long as you're good at engaging and communicating with staff, everybody knows the world's changed and everybody is ready for radical change. They've all had to work from home quickly. They've all had to change product bases. They're all getting ready for social distancing. So the idea of further innovation or further technology adoption, actually there's a high readiness for us. The metabolism of these businesses for change has grown in the last 4 or 5 months. So that gives me some optimism that we're going to see more dynamic firm level behavior. Again, we're also going to see, you know, profound economic harm. So I'm not pretending that that's going to lead to, you know, immense growth. But I think that's the kind of change that actually, in a quite an interesting way, could take hold.
I agree with you both, and I share your optimism. I think what we see in other contexts is that, you know, our behavior is extremely sensitive to our environment. And so when contexts shift radically, our behavior shifts with it, as we've seen with people working from home, for example. But they also tend to shift back very quickly when contexts revert. So I think that there's something to be done over the next 12 to 18 months as we do have this slow reversion back to normality of how to maintain some of those positive things. There's actually an audience question on this that I want to read out. Oh, I've just lost it. I've got quite a few in here now. Let me find it again. It was from Dilshad. He said, what would be the major difference? Oh no, sorry, the next one he asked. How should we think about incorporating resistance and resilience to shock as a factor into the small business owner's mindset in order to make them respond better to crises like this in the future? So you both touched on these capability and confidence issues. How do you think we embed this mindset of readiness for change and embracing change in the future?
I think as Tony said, we've seen a lot of change and resilience in businesses, and the one thing we're looking at and talking to businesses about is about that resilience planning to make sure, you know, they are shocked into doing something at the right time. It's really interesting having been through. I'm going to sound really negative. These responses I make sound quite negative at the moment. I've been through, I think, 4 or 5 big recessions in my 40 years in corporate finance. My stock answer is nothing changes. And it's kind of a throwback to the last question as well. Nothing changes. We remember the last recession and everything was going to change, particularly from the FCA perspective, government controls. And yet where we are now pre-COVID, you know, we've gone back to how we were working pre-2007, you know, in the growth bubble. I think that businesses have been shocked more so this time round than they were in the last recession, and probably more so than they were in the noughties, in the 90s and in the 80s where we had recession. And I think maybe there will be some lasting response to this one, whereas in the past, as I've said, you know, nothing seems to change. I think businesses need to understand that things have changed, and the one thing that we're trying to embed with businesses is that aspect of continuous planning, continuous assessment, understanding your position, And it kind of starts from a finance perspective with that understanding of what your 13-week cash flow looks like, what your critical payments are, what, you know, where your cash flow sits, I guess, is important to the start of that resilience planning, and making sure that that strategy planning and that resilience planning is always on the desk, and you're only one step away from the next crisis. So it's about making sure that crisis planning doesn't happen when you're in a crisis, but it happens before.
And what do you think is the best way to prompt businesses to do that planning?
Is to what, sorry, Elizabeth?
What do you think is the best way to prompt businesses to do that planning on an ongoing basis?
I guess that's a good question. I suppose we as in business support make sure we keep it to the fore of everything we do in terms of speaking to businesses, and we make sure when we're talking to businesses in webinars such as this, we keep it to the fore. We make sure that businesses understand that as part from the kind of cradle to the grave through the startup process. We work with a lot of startup businesses. The Northwest has got more than its fair share of startups. It's really interesting, going back to something Tony said, the Northwest has got more than its fair share of business deaths as well. Startup, from early stage businesses, it's probably at the top of the list when we come to business deaths. That's simply because we're very creative as a region in starting up businesses, whether that's in the DCT sector, whether it's in a range of other sectors. So I guess we need to make sure that businesses fully understand when we're embedding information into startup businesses that this kind of crisis planning, resilience planning is an important aspect of how they take matters forward.
Just on resilience, a couple of things. The biggest resilience question that I have encountered with SMEs is a strategic business resilience one. It's about diversification. So coming back to my metaphor about people feeling like the music stopped in a game of musical chairs and they had nowhere to sit. A lot of that was not about, gosh, it's really hard to work from home. It was about, I'm very focused on one product offer, or I'm overly reliant on a channel, or staff haven't got a diversity of skills. And so what's interesting about the whole innovation shift is that this is where innovation and resilience are part of the same thing. People are innovating to make sure, their online channel is as good as their shop, or they've got a second product that works in different environments. So I wouldn't underestimate that a lot of the resilience thinking is actually a fundamental business model piece of thought. But coming back to what I think you mean by resilience, a couple of the most interesting things I've heard from businesses is that they activated their business recovery plan, right? So they activated plans that you use if there's a fire, because that was sort of the only place, to Philip's point about planning, that was the only place where they wrote stuff down like, how would we get in touch with staff if they're not in the office? How would we use technology to access systems? And of course, they're all now looking at it's a good time to be in business continuity planning sales.
Yeah.
So I think everybody's thinking about, and some more great stories about, gosh, all my sales contacts were on the Rolodex in the office, and I need to be making sales calls, and I don't have a CRM system to be able to access my customers whatsoever. And so I think a lot of that resilience is, there's a lot, of course, that's about financial resilience and cash reserves and all the stuff Philip does for a living. But I think there is strategic resilience, and there's that idea of working effectively and digitally and people participating in that. That was only ever covered in business continuity plans.
And in terms of management practices, a lot of businesses, as you say, are very path dependent. Do you think there's value in encouraging SMEs live contingency plans for the main parts of their strategy and keep those up to date?
Yeah, look, I think it's really interesting what you say, Liz, because I think there are, again, I'm really focused on business leaders and how hard it is to be a business owner right now. Because I think you need to have two dominant mindsets. It's a bit like if anybody ever reads Ron Heifetz's leadership literature from Harvard. He talks about leaders needing to be able to do two things. One is need to be very present in the action, and the other one is being, aloof and on the balcony and thinking about what's next. And I think that's what business owners are going to start doing. I think on the one hand, they're going to be very, very active in day-to-day margin management. They're going to be squeezing 1% wherever they can find them. They're going to be rolling out any practices. They're going to be bean counting, and they're going to be doing a lot of that. But you are right, they will also have to be doing a lot more horizon scanning. And I think that feeling of vulnerability as to whether or not my business is diversified, sustainable, appropriate to emerging trends, they're going to have to think about it at the same time. So they're going to be like a porter, on the one hand, very in the detail, and on the other hand, quite a lot of horizon scanning for whether or not they're frankly future-proof.
Very interesting. I'm going to turn to some more audience questions. There's a very interesting question from Mari of any reflections on the use of data, particularly by government, in scaling up business support or the adoption of productivity enhancing measures. I guess I'd like to put a spin on this, which is there a piece of data that either of you would love to have that you don't currently have, that would help you understand the challenges that businesses are facing or understand the potential opportunities ahead?
We'd love to get our hands on HMRC data, but we can't for obviously GDPR reasons. We'd love to understand what businesses are going through. So we'd love to get our sticky paws on the HMRC data, which says, what income levels and tax levels, particularly small businesses, are paying or delivering. We'd love to be able to reach out to businesses and say, we're here to support you. I mean, as I said before, we're reaching out to 25,000 businesses, but we're buying data. Some of that data is flawed. We'd love to we'd love government to give us some data and to be able to reach out to those businesses and say, support is here, help is here. We can help you to, traverse the minefield of information that's coming out of government and help you to get, build back better, which is the name of the game, is to get is to help businesses who may not realize they need some help at this moment in time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One is, I at the moment I am obsessed with qualitative insight and actually behavioral insight. I'm not just saying that, Liz, because you're here. Because I just do not underestimate what an unprecedented context this is for leaders to make decisions. And I really think that anybody who's in the business support game needs to be under the skin of how those leaders are going to make decisions. I think if there was quantitative data, almost, and maybe the accounting providers and the banks can help us with this, almost the live purchasing decisions of what the decisions people are taking. What are they buying? What have they stopped buying? What are they implementing? What are they not implementing? Because I think, as we all know from all of us that do survey work, right, you want to triangulate it with behavior, with actual behavior, with actual consumption. But, it's such a moving feast at the moment. And I think if you'd survey business leaders about their confidence levels 3 months ago, I predict they would have been high. I predict they're very low now. And I don't think that they will return to a high level until there's a bit more certainty in where demand is in the economy.
Fantastic. Unfortunately, we're almost out of time. So I'm going to ask you each to offer some closing reflections. So we have many policymakers on the line. What, in summary, do you think is the top priority for business owners right now? And therefore, what should be the top priority for policymakers?
Look, I would say that confidence to be ambitious, confidence to grow is critical. And I think probably the biggest challenge for policymakers is I personally believe that SME owners have really appreciated government support during the crisis. They really know that government was there for them. And there is a risk now that government will rightly, for financial reasons, withdraw from propping up the economy to some degree. But the risk is that businesses they go from everything to nothing. Of that feeling of support and encouragement and incentive to grow. And because of the cash situation, and we don't have time to talk about recapitalization of businesses, but because of cash situations, there is going to be, Rishi talks about wanting to avoid scarring in the economy. Mm-hmm. Every firm and a micro firm is going to be taking their own individual decisions about growth or not growth, which all add up to the scarring in the economy. So policies that focus on boosting the confidence, incentives, and abilities for those firms to choose growth, over standing still or over retrenchment. I think that's the name of the game.
Great. Choose growth seems like a good catchphrase for the next phase. Philip, what about you?
That sounds outstanding. I couldn't, great phrase, Tony, and I agree. The support which government has provided has been exceptional and outstanding. I mean, we know a few businesses have fallen through the cracks, and where those cracks emerged, government was quick to try and paper over those cracks. So we've got to give Rishi and the government, a big thumbs up in terms of the support they've provided. What I would say, and it's purely from a finance perspective, is we need to get long-term capital into businesses, not short-term capital. We potentially need less debt, more investment stakes in businesses, and I think government needs to do more through the British Business Bank to engage with a range of funders, whether that's public, private sector, or a mix, to get long-term capital into businesses to support that long-term sustained growth.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank you both very much for joining us today and sharing your insights. We've had a wide-ranging conversation about the complexity and challenges ahead of SMEs, but I think also a very hopeful conversation about the opportunities ahead, particularly for innovation, for building connection between businesses and building the confidence and capability of businesses through this crisis and beyond. So I hope the participants have enjoyed it. Thank you for your questions and your participation. We will put a recording of this online. Please do share it with your networks. We're also continuing with the next instalment of the Hindsight 2020 webinar next Wednesday, where we'll be talking about sustainable transport behaviours. So thank you, Philip. Thank you, Tony, for a fascinating discussion. And thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.